This is Block 9 of the liberal establishment with the section Anti-War Demonstrations. The anti-war movement began small in 1965 on college campuses. There was the occasional teach-in, the occasional sit-in. But as 1965 wore on and the war continued to escalate, and President Johnson continued to be on television explaining that the war would be over soon and that the North Vietnamese would be defeated soon, and as the escalation continued and as the casualties continued, more and more Americans began to turn against the war and began to turn against the draft. That America, had a military draft. And you were drafted based on your birthday, that if your birthday, you got a number, and that number was, put in a big thing and turned, and voila, you would be called, and then you would be responsible. My camera's about to fall off the table. There we go. You would be inducted into the Army. As 1965 turned into 1966, these demonstrations started to snowball and soon became this enormous tidal wave. Thousands of Americans fled to Canada to avoid the draft. Thousands more publicly burned their draft cards, daring the government to come arrest them. Hundreds of thousands marched in the streets to demand an end to the war. That the point of the war, it was not obvious to Americans what the point of the war was. It was not obvious to Americans what the mission in the war was. It was not obvious to Americans what we were doing there in the first place. And people began to demand that Johnson end the war. There were professional radicals, if you will, that were kind of the leadership in a way of these anti-war demonstrations. And they were typical progressive communist types. Their parents had largely supported Stalin in the 1930s. And they led this anti-war movement down a path where it became very, very personal, very, very quickly. That instead, the war was a target, the draft was a target, and President Johnson himself became a personal target of a lot of these anti-war demonstrators chanting slogans like, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Lyndon Johnson, think whatever you like of the man, was not a man who enjoyed the killing of children. As was implied by many of the anti-war protesters. And this, was very popular on campus, which is interesting in a sense that going to college deferred you from the draft, that if you were a college student, they would not draft you. So kids in college, who tended to kind of be more of the, so there's kids in college that tend to be a little more middle class, upper middle class are the ones not going to fight, while working class people and poorer Americans were the ones going off to fight. But the war's support, as time wore on, remained in working class households, while people who turned against the war were kind of your upper middle class type households. Why did Vietnam create such a powerful backlash? That lots of things are going on in the 1960s. There's just a revolt against authority in general, and the Vietnam War became symbolic of that authority that people were revolting against. We're going to talk a lot about this in Block 10, the revolt against authority. But a sense developed that anybody over the age of 30 could not be trusted by people under the age of 30. In the United States. And the Vietnam War was just, the focal point of a lot of this anti-authority, kind of mindset, that music was changing, habits were changing, and the Vietnam War was a focus of it all. So why did we turn against it? Other reasons. That first and foremost, it's a symbol of authority in an era where authority of every type is under attack from every direction. But I think we could name 6 things that I've identified here, and I think all 6 of them played a key role in the reason why the war in Vietnam was hated and scorned by so many Americans, more than any war before or since. That number one, victory seemed very difficult and very hard to define. That it was not a war of territory. We've mentioned this in class, that you could not follow the course of an army on a map like you could in the Civil War and World War I and World War II and Korea. That American troops were fighting all over Vietnam at all different times in all different places, that there's not a front line that you can follow the course of and follow the Army's progress. And the Army made great progress. The Army kept South Vietnam a viable country for 10 years when the South Vietnamese could not have done it otherwise. Number two, the second reason, and go back, remember, if you remember those pictures from Operation Rolling Thunder, the idea started to percolate in the United States that what is going on, that the United States, the most powerful country in the world's greatest superpower, is using so much of its power and so much of its might to blast a third world country back to the Stone Age. That so many bombs were dropped over Vietnam, more than all the other wars, in the history of the world put together. It seemed a little bit unfair that Americans like considering ourselves the underdog. That Americans are always the little guy, whether it was the Revolutionary War against the British, or fighting the slave power, or marching off to defeat Hitler, or marching off to save Europe from the Kaiser, that Americans have always thought of themselves as the common man, the little guy, where a regular old, common man can rise up to be president, that a man from nothing can become very rich. Americans like seeing ourselves as underdogs. And now you cannot be less of an underdog than the United States was in Vietnam. That the United States has, missile-guided bombs, supersonic bombers, those enormous B-52s that were on there, hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives, chemical deforestation weapons, tanks, artillery, and we're using all this stuff that's designed to fight the Soviets in Germany. We're using it to blast the hell out of a bunch of peasants in Vietnam. And it just seemed unfair in a lot of ways. Third, it became increasingly clear that many people who were fighting in the Viet Cong were not communists. That we were fighting communists to a degree, but we were also fighting people who were just sick and tired of the corruption of the South Vietnamese government. That we were fighting people who just wanted to be left alone by the rest of the world. That's a sense that's powerful in American history. That we fought the Revolutionary War to get rid of the British. A lot of people are associating the Viet Cong with the patriots of the American Revolution. That they just want people out. They want Vietnam to be Vietnamese. That they fought to get rid of the Japanese. They fought to get rid of the French. And now they're fighting to get rid of the Americans. Why can't we just leave these poor people alone? Becomes the sense of a lot of anti-war demonstrators on campus. That we're not fighting Karl Marx, we're not fighting Lenin, we're not fighting Stalin, we're not even fighting Khrushchev or Brezhnev, we're just fighting peasants who are calling themselves communists because that's against the side of a corrupt government. That they call them, that the peasant, not the leadership, the North Vietnamese leadership is communist. After the war is over, they're going to take a communist course, in their country's social and political organizations. But for the average peasant who signs up with the Viet Cong, many of them just were patriots that wanted the Americans out, just like, and not because they were Americans, just because they didn't belong there. And that was a sense that, it touched a lot of Americans' sense of justice in that regard. The fourth reason, the war was televised. Americans at home see the horrors of war up close every night. This is something new. This is something new in Vietnam. It's put on television, and more Americans are even having color television by the mid-1960s and early 1970s. That war has been hell forever. That war was hell you know, when the Greeks fought the Persians at Thermopylae. But the memories, but what people knew of war visually before Vietnam was just told by the stories of the men who were there or the artists who saw it, that there was something between war and your eye, whether it was memory or whether it was a photograph, a still photograph, or whether it was a drawing, that the awfulness of war was distant to people. In Vietnam, the awfulness of war came right up into America's living rooms every single night. It's number 5, also has to do with television. Number 5, that the American people are taking large casualties for what seems to be very little gain. That if Americans are dying and we're getting something done, the American people can support that to a degree. But when Americans are dying and there's no obvious end in sight, there's no obvious gain, there's no obvious march towards victory here in the Vietnam War, Americans start to say, well, what are we sacrificing all of these men for? Every night on television, the news networks would announce how many Americans were killed that day, how many enemy was killed that day, and they would literally put the body count right up on television. 103 Americans were killed, 568 North Vietnamese Viet Cong were killed. Okay, great, we killed a lot of Viet Cong, a lot of Americans died. What is it getting us? What's the success here? Is the South Vietnamese government any better? Are the Viet Cong less likely to attack? Is the North Vietnamese ready to come to the negotiating table? None of these things were happening, so all of these casualties on both sides start to make Americans say, well, what's the point of this? What is all of this slaughter? What is all of this bloodshed actually changing? And the answer was, it didn't seem to be changing very much at all. And most importantly, the draft itself, you have to look at selfish motivations. The draft was a looming reality for millions of Americans. It is a looming nightmare for millions of Americans raised on the comfort and ease of the 1950s. That these are not their fathers raised on the Depression and going off to fight a war that's easily understood against Japan or a war that's easily understood against Hitler. These are the children of material wealth. These are the children of never having a difficult day in their lives, really. And now all of a sudden they're going to be asked to, or not asked, they're going to be forced to go halfway around the world, fight a war that they don't understand, fight a war with a questionable rationale, and fight a war with no victory in sight. You look at it in that regard, and no wonder that the Vietnam War created such a backlash on America's campuses, and in America's cities, and in America's streets. That the war didn't seem fair, had no end in sight, could not be monitored easily, and finally, the war would have to be fought by a generation of children who had no desire to fight a war and had no desire for a war to intervene with whatever life plans that they had. And in a sense, we can't blame them. And in another sense, it's easy to. If you tended to be against the war, you know, you fully supported the demonstrators and all of their reasons, of course. If you tended to say, look, you know, military service is a part of citizenship, you know, you looked at the people who burned their draft cards and you referred to them, as my history teacher once said, as left-wing, long-haired, maggot-infested, frisbee-throwing whack jobs. That you started to get this massive cultural divide in the United States. A divide between those who wanted to be out immediately and those who were going to do their duty because, as they saw it, it was the right thing to do.